Hi everybody, Don Klassen here again. The title of today's video is Russia's Legacy of Cruelty, Ruthlessness and Treachery. And it's based upon an article I posted almost 2 weeks ago now on my blog, donklassenseriousguy.com. The progress of the war there in Ukraine is such that the concern I had that perhaps we were heading toward World War II with the approach toward Passover, I kind of began to realize toward the end of March it probably wasn't going to happen, thankfully, and that we have more time, that this World War III would not start, the Great Tribulation would not start this year. Perhaps some other situation, but all the same, the situation in Ukraine is very, very dire and excruciating and grievous to watch. I love that country. Just yesterday, I think, or this morning actually, over their time, Russia began bombing Odessa, my favorite city over there. And they want to move into Moldova from there. They want to take the entire south, which puts to the lie to Putin's original intention that he had no intention of expanding the Russian Empire. He was just wanting to denazify Ukraine. Well, it turns out, after all, he wants Moldova. He wants as much as he can grab without actually provoking NATO too much. And it's a very, still a very volatile situation. Thankfully, the United States is responding with the kind of artillery and help that Ukraine needs, a little bit too late. Somebody once said that America always does the right thing, but always at the last minute, when after every other option has been exhausted. Well, that may be true, I don't know, but at any rate, I've also been a little bit ambivalent about what to do about this video channel, because I didn't intend to start it right this time. Quite frankly, my biggest pressing problem is getting a better financial foundation in my life. I've got a business, but I've got to transit out of it. I'm just getting too old for the physical labor, and I need to do something online, something that will give me the options to do this right, to learn video editing, get the scripts all made, create a curriculum or whatever it would take according to the different subjects I want to take on in a certain order, so you can have a systematic approach toward the subject of Bible prophecy and perhaps even other Bible study in general, because the times we're living in are just terrible. People are not getting Bible teaching at Bible-believing churches. They're getting mind science, success principles, prosperity principles, word of faith teachings, dominionist theology, which is an incredible heresy, a very heretical view of the last days. It's very dangerous. The things going on right now are astounding. I just yesterday checked Christian Broadcasting Network's 700 Club to see what kind of news they had yesterday. Because on Thursday, a blockbuster story was broken, I think by Rachel Maddow, and a number of other news outlets are picking up on it now, that Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, had a conference call with top Republican leaders a few days after the insurrection, whereby they were discussing impeaching Donald Trump, and even Mitch McConnell wanted to bring 17 senators along to convict him, so he wouldn't be able to run ever again for public office, at the very least. And so, and all this time they were denying, he had denied to the press and called the press fake news when they reported that he had this phone call and this conversation. And after they denied it vehemently and they double-checked, the men who wrote this book released the tapes of the phone call, just catching them dead to rights. And I wanted to see if the 700 Club even, what they had to say about it. And it turns out they didn't even mention it. This is the problem. People turn to these alternative media sources on the right wing. And if they get bad news for their cause, they just don't cover it. Or they'll call it fake news. They're always attacking the mainstream media or trying to do the job of journalism, the fourth estate. I mentioned this before about Trump's cynicism, about manipulating the media to constantly cover him, knowing that they would do their due diligence to protect the American public from his lies. And yet that would be like the daily dumpster fire that would keep people from investigating all the real corruption going on behind the scenes in his administration. So I really want to help develop this in the minds of American Christians, just how they are being manipulated. This is not a good situation. People are heading for a strong delusion and apostasy. And if you don't understand the nature of the moral issue of our time, you're going to be swept away by it, and you will lose your salvation. I'm not one of these people who believes once saved, always saved. Even John Calvin didn't believe that. He believed in the perseverance of the saints, and that you have to endure to the end. You have to be faithful to the end. The Bible's full of all kinds of exhortations that do exactly that. Well, at any rate, in today's installment here, I want to talk a little bit about Russia, because so many of today's Christians and younger people especially are very ignorant of Russia's legacy of cruelty and brutality that has been going on for 100 years now, over 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And because of this, they've been falling for the siren song of Vladimir Putin, that he's some kind of a crusader for family values and that sort of thing, because the Russian Orthodox Church he's kind of hiding behind or using as a front for his cynical Machiavellian dictator politics. And same like Trump. I mean, anything that the West tries to point out his convoluted propaganda lines about Ukraine attacking their own people in order to stage things to make it look like the Russians are doing atrocities are so ridiculous. But he calls them fake news. And just like Trump does. And people have to get an idea of just how dangerous this epistemological war is, that people are being siloed, and the United States is still very divided because people are not listening to empirical facts. They make up their own facts according to what they're told, and they're easily manipulated. So I want to go over the history of Russia a little bit here, because going back to the Bolshevik Revolution, that's where their problems really began. Until then, they were kind of under the control of the czars, which are something of a Russian Orthodox legacy. But with the coming in of the communists came the triumph of the Khazarian rivalry between the Russians and the Khazarians, going back to the 8th century AD when they converted to Judaism. And they brought in a very perverse offshoot of Talmudic philosophy and the idea of relative truth and all that, with their communist theory, which is designed actually to rob the Gentiles of their property, their sovereignty, nationality, and their cultural identity. And the second phase would be the establishment of a Zionist state in Israel, or Palestine. This is all Moses Hess's plan that was discovered later on by the Zionist leaders after they had established the nation of Israel. So we have a very, a whole nother subject there about the American church's blind idolatry toward Israel, when we ought to have a more even-handed approach, sort of like the Democratic administrations have had, trying to bring about peace, because that's the right thing to do, to make the Palestinians whole, some of which are Christians themselves, and to bring peace in the Middle East, as we should be doing. But instead, we've kind of given all, just the whole farm to Israel, whatever they wanted, and it's caused a lot of problems. But at any rate, when the Khazarians took over, mostly, in this Russian Revolution, they replaced truth and journalism, or any semblance of it, with propaganda, state narrative, myth, psyops, all the characteristics of the modern state. They kind of started this modern Machiavellian trend. Until that time, the world was more or less still under the Christian paradigm or Enlightenment paradigm of absolute truth. the thing that Christians decry the loss of nowadays. And with this paradigm shift came a terrible disorientation into the world. That this theme was picked up by Goebbels and the Nazi regime, which is the right-wing version of totalitarianism, and he perfected it into the big lie theory. And then after the war, the CIA, the Mossad, the MI6, the KGB, and other modern intelligence agencies perfected it into this whole world of manipulation, of propaganda, of, or as the Pentagon puts it, tactical perception management. In other words, we don't care if what we're doing is right or wrong or true or false in terms of what we tell you. We only care about your perception of it and how best to manage it. It's very cynical. So this is part of what we're fighting in our time, is this battle between what Jesus championed, which was absolute truth, which will make you free, that our entire democracy is dependent upon, the truth, the whole truth, and the nothing but the truth, as opposed to the lies of totalitarian governments. And what's really, really disturbing, so the Republican Party apparently is ready to jump into fascism, or autocracy, to get around the fact that they're so unpopular right now, because every day they're being exposed for some new hypocrisy that they were lying about for so long that they're not even covering. I mean, it's really, really astounding to watch. And it's a crisis of the highest order in our country. And we have to stand for the truth. And there's not a partner at this point. The only people in the Republican Party, like Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger or Mitt Romney, those are the few Republicans left that have any commitment to democracy, which is what our system is. It's a constitutional democratic republic. Someday I'll elaborate on that a bit more. I've also written about it on my website. Well, when Putin took over the head of Russia in the turn of this century, we didn't know what to make of him at first. We were watching him carefully to see what he's made of. He's a former KGB agent. He comes from that Soviet mentality. He considered the fall of the Soviet Union the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, whereas the rest of the world thought it was the greatest liberation to see that Berlin Wall come down and all that sort of thing. And he began to quickly show his true colors, but we weren't paying much attention. This Ukraine war has really made it very crystal clear who this guy is. Well, during World War II, the United States made an alliance with the Soviet Union out of convenience in order to defeat Nazi Germany. At the first, Germany had a pact with Russia, a non-aggression pact, and they both invaded Poland at the beginning of the war. And the KGB carried out these executions of 22,000 Polish army officers and intelligentsia and other people that they blamed on the Nazis, when actually it was their doing. They admitted to it back in the 1990s after the Soviet Union fell. And so that's one of the first things, the first examples of in Russia's history of this brutality. Of course, before that was the gulags and Stalin's arrest and torture and killing of millions of Russians. And we've seen the legacy of this terrible idea. I mean, Mao, he took it even further with his cultural revolutions and revolution and his attempts at more and more experimentation on people, social experimenting with people's lives, that sort of thing, Pol Pot, etc. Although other forms of communism have been a lot more mild, like the Sandinistas, who were voted into power, and when they were voted out, they left without an incident. So, you know, it's a mixed bag, this communist phenomenon, but the Soviets were a real foe because they were a nuclear power. They were a third-rate power in every other way, but they had nuclear weapons. That's why there was a Cold War after the war that we entered into. In spite of that pact, we had a temporary pact with Russia in World War II. So after that, we had that 10-year period under Yeltsin, where democracy was not going real well, and Putin kind of seized on that and slowly began to consolidate power. He spent most of his time consolidating his wealth, getting in charge of all the oligarchs, stealing from the country. It's one of the reasons his military is so ragged and such a paper tiger, is because they have such a system of graft and of kleptocracy there. Everybody's stealing so that people who get insider deals for defense contracts and that sort of thing will just deliver bad parts or no parts at all. And so they go into war, and he won't allow people to tell him the truth. That's one of the Achilles heels of autocracy, as Tony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, put it, that they don't get good information. Whereas in democracies, you hire experts, you get people around you to fill in the gaps that you don't know, as the president or other executives, making policy decisions and that sort of thing. It's a far superior system, far more professional, far more in touch with reality. And yet, we seem to be ready to throw it all away because some people just hate liberals so much. And it's understandable in some ways that it's identity politics and all that, how irritating they can be. But all the same, there's ways we can work these things out, but we're not doing it. Now, Putin has this background, and he's a very brutal guy. But Russia in general has had a real history of brutality. Stalin, before the war, during the 1930s, starved 5 million Ukrainians to death to punish them for their desire for it to be an independent state and for a sort of revamp his industrialization program. It's just cold-blooded beyond words. It was called the Holodomor before the Holocaust was even heard of. And that was one example of Russia's cruelty. They had the killing of the officers there at Katyn Forest, the Polish army officers. After the war, they had, there's a rape during the war, after the war, there was a rape of Germany. I mean, the Russian soldiers went through the land and just raped, I think something like up to 2 million German women and other women in Germany on their way to Berlin. It was just a horrific, but covered up event in many ways. And this was from the highest levels of authority. They were allowed to do this, from Stalin, to punish the Germans for attacking them. After Putin became president, there had already been a war in Grozny, Chechnya, and so he wanted to go back for part 2. And he made a deal with the Chechen rebels there that they could leave the city peacefully. And instead he ambushed them on their way out and killed many of them, and then went in and completely leveled the city, just like they've been doing to Mariupol right now, and what they plan on doing on every city that stands in their way. This is very, very chilling stuff. I don't know how the West can ignore this. We have to engage them. I mean, in spite of their threats to use nuclear weapons, we have to take that chance, because Zelensky did it. He stood up like David to Goliath, and God helped him. He's helped their country to stave off this Goliath of a giant of a nation that's turning out to be largely a paper tiger. They are so disorganized. They have so many morale problems and every other thing going on, but they're resorting to cruelty now as a way of punishment. After this happened, there was another crisis in Russia, the Moscow theater crisis. There was actually the way that, going back to the Grozny, Chechnya, thing that helped him become the president, the outright president. He was running for president at the time. The FSB, his former agency, were caught red-handed in a third bombing attempt on Moscow apartments. So we know that the FSB was behind these acts of terror in order to create a state to make Putin look good and to step in as the big, young, strong leader. And his domestic popularity went through the roof as he took charge as the tough leader and all that sort of thing against the crisis he had created. So there was that. Then about a couple of years later, the Chechen rebels again took an actual theater in Moscow hostage with, I think, 850 people taken hostage. And so the Russians pumped in a narcotic gas, a form of fentanyl, the same drug that's terrorizing Americans here who use heroin. It's killing them. It's a very deadly form of heroin or a substitute for heroin that's cartels are using. It's very dangerous stuff. And it killed, I think, 40 terrorists, but also 130 hostages. But at least he showed him who his boss. This is part of his pattern. An even more egregious incident took place 2 years after this, in 2004, in the Beslan school massacre, where Chechen rebels again took 1,100 hostages, including 777 children. Just as a negotiated settlement was about to take place after weeks of a standoff, or days at least, I forget how long it was, shots started being fired from outside the building, which was from the Russians, breaking the negotiated peace, which led to a fight. And in the end, 333 people died, including 186 children, from their heavy-handed tactics again. But of course, he was tough. This is the kind of, they don't know the difference between a strong leader and a vicious, brutal one. That's what I'm trying to say about the American right wing. Don't fall for their lies and distortions and the things that they worship, which is strong leaders. I mean, they're such doormats. They don't want to be adults. They don't want to be citizens who will stand up and do the right thing and be heard and counted and say, no, we're not going to be just told what to do. We can think for ourselves. They want people to tell them what to think. It's just disgusting. I found this in the church world so much, that there was so much of a cult-like atmosphere that you would just kind of follow orders because everybody wants to be accepted in a fellowship. It's a social life. Sometimes it's the only social life you may have. And yet, you would ask real, legitimate questions of things and they didn't want to hear it. I mean, whatever happened to loving the Lord your God with all of your mind? This is what one of my biggest complaints about the church world is in our time. Another incident was in 2016 when Russia was caught with a wholesale attack upon our elections that year, benefiting Donald Trump, their agent of chaos here in America, that tried to tear up NATO, even the EU. Daley was trashing all of our traditions and all of our laws, and he's the most lawless man I've ever seen in my life. You don't even know where to prosecute him. And but they were even the Republican-held Senate had a committee led by Marco Rubio, and they put out a report affirming that the Republicans had really hacked into our elections. I guess they didn't want to broadcast it too much because it obviously was to their benefit. But still, they had at least the decency to actually, tell the truth about it. So it wasn't just these democratic, fake news type takes on this. And you had, of course, the Mueller report afterwards that proved all these connections to Russia that the Trump campaign had. So these are some of the examples of the modern ways that Russia is truly still an enemy. Because the war we're having with them right now is not Russia versus the United States or Russia versus NATO. It's about democracy and freedom versus dictatorship and all of the problems that come with it. Because he's in a bind now, and Russian Soviet leaders have always been either die in office or they're carried out in a body bag. That's always been the way they've settled their differences, through putches and backstabbing and all these. We have an orderly process called elections here. Or if you don't win one cycle, you might win the next one. if you can come up with policies that people actually want, because it's oriented toward the people's wishes, because we're not supposed to treat them like they're ignoramuses, or they don't know what's best for them. This is a moral battle between good and evil. It's so clear. This Ukrainian war has made it so clear to me that in spite of the fact that America has an empire with all this huge military and is often resorts to heavy-handed tactics to spread democracy around the world, sometimes under the false pretenses of wanting to grab someone's resources, which is often a Republican approach, the shock and awe and taking the oil and all that sort of thing. It's an internal problem in our own country. But still, they do want to spread democracy and free trade and that sort of thing, or at least some sort of a world trade alliance, so that when nations are trading together, they're less likely to go to war. It's actually is a strategy for keeping peace in the world, and it's pretty effective, and it also creates a lot of prosperity. Well, so anyway, that's pretty much, I cover this in that article. I'm going to post it down there below and the notes regarding this video, and you can read it there. I don't know what to do about the channel at this point, because I want to do it right. I want to have a script. So when I do things off the cuff and off the fly, sometimes I might kind of get into the anointing and things. I covered a lot of things today, a little bit haltingly, but I often leave things out, as I write better than I present. But I'm working on it. And with experience comes, practice makes perfect and all that. So I'm a little bit, ambivalent about what to do, because I really need to take care of my finances. I've got some health issues to deal with. And it's just, there's a lot to take care of at my age. And so I'm just trying to do this right. And I hope that you keep checking and seeing if more is available. I posted for briefly a little video saying I'm just pausing the channel, but I didn't feel quite right about it. So thanks for listening today. Keep checking back, and hope to have more for you in the future. Have a good night now.